It is currently 7 o'clock p.m. on New Year's Eve, the end of a decade. There are people in the other room of my apartment because apparently we're hosting a party, but I am hiding in my closet. I've had 4 cups of coffee, and I have to keep my voice down because there's a party going on. I think it's the perfect time to talk about some Mongol history. Welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a podcast where you and I look at the man known to history as Timur, a great Turco-Mongolian leader who rose to power in the mid-14th century and carved out for himself a grand empire across the Middle East and Central Asia. And as you're probably aware, we haven't gotten quite to Timur yet, but we are getting closer. So if you're new to the show, welcome, and we're glad that you're here. What we've been up to is that for the past few episodes, we've been laying the groundwork for the coming of Timur. We began by looking at the 4 great Khans of the Mongol Empire, Genghis, Ogedai, Guyuk, and Munk, along with a few queens. And last week we looked at the life of Kublai Khan, the 5th great Khan and the founder of the Yuan Dynasty. So before we go on, let's do some minor housekeeping real quick. First of all, Happy New Year! I hope you've had a wonderful holiday season with good friends, food, and family, and overall hopefully a good 2019. Secondly, a few things about last episode. A few people reached out to me to say that my recording at home wasn't really an issue, so thank you for reaching out. That really helps me out. So I'm going to continue recording here at my apartment for the time being. It's just much easier that way. But if the sound quality bothers you, let me know, and I might change that later on. Again, the easiest way to reach out to me for any reason at all is email at timurpodcast@gmail.com, Twitter at podcasttimur, or Facebook at timurpod. And I love and I need feedback of all kinds, so please don't hesitate to contact me for any reason. Also, in regards to last episode, a listener pointed out kind of a big problem. He said that I kind of sounded like I was blaming Kublai Khan for the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire. I can't talk. And so you'll remember last week I had those 3 rules that the Mongols needed to maintain in order to keep their empire, and Kublai either broke them or was ruling when they broke. And listening back, yeah, that person is absolutely right. There are some parts where I sound like I'm blaming Kublai for the whole thing. So just to clear that up, I didn't mean to do that at all. Kublai was not the reason the Mongol Empire broke apart. In fact, if it was anybody other than Kublai, I think the empire would have dissolved a lot sooner. So in no way did I mean to blame Kublai for destroying Mongolian unity. Okay, so now that's all cleared up. Let's get started. Now, as I've said a million times before, knowing the history of the Mongol Empire is vital in understanding the life of Timur. So that's what we've been doing. We began by looking at the 4 big boys, the 4 great Khans who founded, grew, and expanded the Mongol Empire into being really the strongest and largest empire of the day. Those dudes, if you'll remember, were Genghis Khan, Ogedai Khan, Guyuk Khan, and Munk Khan. And I guess now is as good a place as any to bring up a big historical question. And this is one of those questions that you'll hear every once in a while. One of those historical questions that is still being debated about today. And that is, how many great Khans of the Mongol Empire were there? Because there's really no correct answer to this, at least as far as I can tell, and there are a few answers that all have pretty good arguments. The easiest answer to this question is 4. 4 great Khans of a unified Mongol Empire. The guys I just said a minute ago. But then, after that, things get complicated. Does anybody who claims to be the great Khan count? Because if that's the case, then we have dozens of great Khans. I mean, there are probably still people around today that claim to be the great Khan of Mongolia. I think I've met a few of them, probably. And I've seen historians take different views on this question because this question always pops up when talking about the Mongols. Some have said, as I said earlier, that there were only 4 great Khans, Genghis, Ogedai, Guyuk, and Munk. Others say that there were way more. Basically, any descendant of Genghis Khan in control of a piece of the empire could be considered a great Khan. But the view that I find the most compelling is that to be called a great Khan, you must have ruled over a unified Mongol Empire for at least part of your reign. And if we accept this kind of qualification, then our number of great Khans goes from 4 to 6. We have Genghis, Ogadai, Guyuk, and Monk, of course, but that also includes Kublai, and finally Temur. Not Timur, not our guy, but Temur. Confusing, I know. Everybody in history, they're all named Timur or Temur in this story. It's confusing. Anyway, now, not all historians accept this because of all the years Kublai ruled as Emperor of China and Great Khan, there were only a handful of years, like 4 years. 4 years out of how many? 34? 4 years out of 34 in which Kublai wasn't engaged in some sort of civil war. And of course, during these civil wars, the Mongol Empire is split. So can we really consider Kublai Khan as a great Khan? I mean, the answer is kind of up to you. And similarly, as we'll see with Temur Khan today, his reign is also largely over a split Mongol Empire, which eventually culminates in the empire, yes, getting unified, getting this one last breath of unification. And really, it's only in name, but hey, it's something at least. So should we call Temur Khan the sixth and last great Khan of the Mongol Empire? Kind of up to you. But then, of course, things get even more complicated when you remember the other people who ruled the empire, albeit usually for short periods of time. In between Genghis and Ogadai, Genghis' son Tolui ruled the empire for like 2 years while preparations for a Kurultai were set in place. He wasn't a great Khan, but he did rule the empire in a lot of ways. Or how about Torajan, queen regent of the empire for 5 years between Ogadai and Guyuk? Again, not great Khan, but certainly the ruler of the empire. So the question of how many great Khans were there is a tricky question, and again, there's really no right answer, but I think including Kublai and Temur in that list is quite fair, which, hey, that leads us to our next point, Temur Khan. If you'll remember, Kublai Khan is now dead, and his grandson Temur is about to take the throne of the Yuan Dynasty in actuality, and the throne of the Mongol Empire theoretically, even though half of that empire doesn't recognize him as their leader. So today we're going to start by looking at the reign of Temur Khan, the sixth and perhaps last great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Because after Temur, there's no question the Mongol Empire is no more. But this does not mean the end of the Mongols, just simply that a new chapter is here, the chapter of the Khanates. We've talked about the Khanates quite a bit here and there, but now we're really going to dive deep into what they were. Simply put, the 4 Khanates were 4 different sections or territories of the Mongol Empire that became their own empires after the Mongol Empire dissolved. And as they're best known as, these 4 Khanates were, number 1, the Golden Horde, stretching across what's today the Ukraine, Western Russia, and Northern Kazakhstan. The Ilkhanate, number 2, in what's today Eastern Turkey, Iraq, parts of Syria, Azerbaijan, and Western Iran. The 3rd Khanate was the Chagatai Khanate in what's today Central Asia, Eastern Iran, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and a lot of the other Stan countries, and parts of Western China as well. And finally, the 4th Khanate, the Yuan Dynasty in Eastern China, Mongolia, Korea, and parts of Vietnam and Cambodia at certain times. And we are going to be hearing a lot about these 4 Khanates both now and in the future because all 4 of them are inseparable from the story of Timur. These Khanates are what chronologically bridge the gap between the fall of the Mongol Empire and the rise of Timur. As a side note, sometimes you'll hear other words instead of Khanate. Ulus is often used. Khaganate is sometimes thrown around, and these are not incorrect. I chose to use Khanate because most of the sources I'm using refer to them as Khanates, and that's kind of how people usually refer to them. But that causes a problem because the word Khanate is confusing because what's a Khanate? Which Khanate are you talking about? There were Khanates before the Mongols, there were Khanates during, there were dozens of Khanates afterwards. The term Khanate simply means land that belongs to the Khan. So you'll see it used all over the place, but know that when I use it, at least in the near future, I'm referring to these 4 Khanates. These 4 Khanates that were part of the Mongol Empire and succeeded the Mongol Empire. Anyway, today we are going to begin with the reign of Temur Khan. Then we'll look at Khanate number 1, the Yuan Dynasty, from the death of Temur to really the time of Timur, from Temur to Timur, I guess. Next week we will cover Khanate number 2, the Golden Horde, from the days of Monk Khan to That's my alarm to remind me to pay rent. So Khanate number 2, from the days of Monk to the time of Timur. Then the week after that, if everything goes according to plan, we'll look at Khanate number 3, the Khanate. And the week after that, we'll cover the Chagatai Khanate, the 4th and final Khanate. We're spending a whole episode on these Khanates because all 4 of them are so important to the story of Timur. The Khanate and Chagatai Khanate are the most important, so I might actually split those into 2. Well, I guess it would be 4 episodes, depending on how well that goes. But after that, we are pretty much there. We are pretty much to Timur. And I might add one more episode in there just to make you hate me more. But the point being, we're almost there. Happy New Year. Okay, so enough talking about all that. Let's begin. Kublai Khan was dead. He died on February 18th, 1294, at the age of 79. Now, the bad news is that, if you'll remember, the Mongol Empire is split in half right now. The Yuan Dynasty and the Khanate are faced off against the Chagatai Khanate and the Golden Horde. Not good. But what is good is that Kublai did name one of his sons as a clear successor, so at least there won't be some sort of new civil war. But the bad news is that son is dead. He actually died before Kublai died. So Kublai's supporters and advisors are freaking out and scrambling around because now there is no named heir to the throne. The Chinese subjects are getting rebellious, the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate are pressing down on our borders. What do we do? Who can we put on the Chinese/Yuan Dynasty/Mongol Empire throne? Well, Kublai had a son, and that son had died, like I said, but not before having 3 sons. So these 3 grandsons of Kublai were chosen as candidates to inherit the throne. But actually that's a lie, because one of them had died already, so there were only 2 remaining. A guy by the name of Temur and his brother Gamala. Now both Temur and Gamala were pretty good candidates. They obviously had a good claim to the throne. They had both seen some pretty important leadership roles. They knew how to handle both Mongol traditions and Chinese culture. So to solve whether or not Temur or Gamala would become the next Chinese emperor and Great Khan, this sort of tournament was arranged. Whoever knows the words and the sayings of Genghis Khan the best gets to be the next Khan. Now, I'm not saying we should do away with democracy and choose our next leader based on how well they know the words of Genghis Khan, but it is an intriguing way to go about that. But anyway, as you've probably guessed, Temur knew the words of Genghis the best, and thus was elected as the 6th Great Khan in the year 1294, and he would rule from 1294 until 1307. Now, Temur Khan is an interesting guy because you rarely ever hear about him, and when you do, it's usually some sort of criticism that Temur didn't really do anything while Khan. And this is not really true. See, when Temur took the throne of the Yuan Dynasty, things were terrible. There was, of course, this huge civil war that was raging. Kaidu, the leader of the Ogadai family, wanted to restore his family to the leadership of the entire Mongol Empire, and he had both the Chagatai Khanate and the Golden Horde behind him. That's half of the empire. Temur was also facing quite a bit of unrest among the Chinese people who formed the majority of the population in the Yuan Dynasty. Rumors were even starting to circulate about Chinese nationalism, because why in the world should a bunch of nomadic Mongolians rule over us, right? And to make matters worse, most of the Mongol lords, generals, and various other important peoples ruling in the Yuan Dynasty were either completely corrupt, total drunkards, or inept at even the most simple of tasks. They hated each other, they hated Temur, they hated their Chinese subjects. This Khanate is breaking at the seams. Oh, but it gets worse. Remember those few places outside of China that Kublai had managed to invade and conquer, like parts of Vietnam and Burma? Well, now they too are complaining about high taxes, extortion from Mongol soldiers, maybe even a whisper here or there about independence. Oh, but it gets worse. I can't remember whether or not we talked about this last week, which is bad on my part, but one of the huge changes that Kublai had implemented was for the Yuan government to print and issue paper currency. Now, economically speaking, this was a huge deal. No longer would you have to carry a ton of silver with you if you wanted to buy a horse in a neighboring village. Now you would just have to carry paper, so much easier. So commerce and trade had a huge boost because of this paper currency. But wars are really, really expensive, and Kublai's government had a lot of wars going on, so they had to pay for it somehow. And they had this great idea. We're the ones printing the money. I mean, we could just print as much money as we want and pay for the wars that way. So, finally, a solution. And as you can imagine, this may have worked at first, but then massive inflation just swept through China because of this. The economy took a nosedive, and the government imposed really high taxes to make up for the mistake that they had created. So the economy that Temur has inherited is in chaos, and there are loads of angry peasants who are just done paying those taxes. So, Temur, welcome to being the Emperor and Great Khan. On your plate, you'll see that you've inherited an entire civil war, which we're losing, by the way. You also have massive debt, the economy is broken, the Chinese peasants hate us and hate you, our Mongol lords and aristocrats are constantly drunk or abusing peasants, Vietnam and Burma are trying to secede, there are rebels gathering in the mountains, and now you have to fix all of that. Well, if anybody was up for the job, it was Temur. First of all, Temur's name means Blessed Iron Khan, and if that's not the coolest name meaning ever, then I don't know what is. But let's talk about credentials. Temur's dad died when he was only 21 years old, and from that point on, he was really taken in by Kublai and shadowed Kublai in pretty much everything. Campaigns, court life, governing, you name it. Eventually, Kublai put Temur in charge of the old Mongol capital of Karakorum, and Temur managed to both run it and defend it like 3 times from overwhelming rival forces during the Kaidu-Kublai Civil War. This kid knew how to run cities, how to fight, and how to inspire the men. And you add on top of all of this that Temur knows the old sayings of Genghis Khan the best? Well, he's up to the task. So what does he do? Well, the first thing you gotta do is clean house. You've got Mongol warlords who are addicted to Chinese wine. Boom, alcohol is banned in Mongolia. You've got tons of brilliant Islamic and Confucian scholars who might have an idea or two on how to run the nation. Boom, they're promoted and brought into the court. The people are about to riot because of high taxes? Well, then we'll lower the taxes. Actually, hey, why not just get rid of taxes altogether in the most rebellious cities? Vietnam and Burma are complaining about how we're ruling in their lands. Let's release most of their political and military prisoners in a sign of good faith, lower taxes, and punish our own soldiers if they illegally hurt innocents. And after a few years of putting out these massive fires, the Yuan Dynasty was beginning to stabilize again, thanks mostly to Temur and his advisors. But there still remained one huge issue: the Kaidu-Kublai Civil War that Timur had inherited from his grandfather. Thanks a lot, Grandpa. So Kaidu, leading the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate, was doing all he could to crush the Yuan Dynasty. In 1298, Temur's own son-in-law was in Mongolia with his most trusted military companions, and their job was simple: keep a lookout for Kaidu and defend Mongolia should Kaidu invade. But that's a lot of work. Why don't we throw parties and get super drunk instead? So one night in the midst of this, Kaidu's armies show up. They crash the party and capture this son-in-law. Not good. But not all is lost, because Temur actually has some of Kaidu's family members as hostages. So how about a civilized prisoner exchange? Kaidu says sure, Temur says great, and then Kaidu murders Temur's son-in-law. There can be no peace or compromise. So the civil war goes on for a few years, and honestly, there's not too much to say. We don't know many details about all the campaigns, but what we do know is that both sides won a few battles, both sides lost a few battles. There was a lot of this back and forth tug of war. Isn't war great? But here's the thing: Kaidu is wearing out because he's been fighting this war for a long, long time. How long, you ask? 30 years! So Kaidu prepares for one final push, one final great attack on Temur, and the aim is to take the city of Karakorum, the old Mongolian capital, and from there they push into China. And so the campaign begins. And then Kaidu is injured and dies in 1301, bringing this entire civil war to a fruitless end in 1304. And for 3 years, from 1304 until 1307, there is actually, finally, peace within the Mongol Empire. And all 4 Khanates, pretty much in name only, but hey, that's at least something, all 4 Khanates submit to Temur Khan. And for these short 3 years, there was peace. This was the final breath of the Mongol Empire as a unified faction. After 1307, there will never again be such a thing as a unified Mongolian empire, at least the one created by Genghis Khan. As for Temur Khan, he had done it. The Yuan Dynasty was stabilized, the Mongol Empire was unified, sort of, the rebellions were put down, and the economy was stabilized. And because of this, Temur Khan is remembered quite positively, usually. Unfortunately, though, we will never know what his true potential was, or where he could have taken the empire. Temur Khan died on February 10th, 1307, at the young age of 42. The sixth, and perhaps last great Khan, was gone. And this brings our journey through the history of the Mongol Empire to a close. But like I said earlier, now we're at a new stage, a new chapter, the time of the four Khanates. Now the Khanates have been around pretty much this whole time. Once Genghis Khan had for himself a pretty nice-sized empire, he knew that his four favorite sons would all want as much land and as much power as possible when he would die. Knowing this would jeopardize not just his family but his entire empire, Genghis gave each son their own land to rule. Joch, or Jochi, the eldest son, was dead, but his family was given the land that would become the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which was, as you'll remember, all over the steppes of the Ukraine, Western Russia, and Northern Kazakhstan. The next oldest son, Chagatai, was given the lands of Central Asia, and this land would become known as the helpfully named Chagatai Khanate, after Chagatai. The third son, Ogadai, didn't get a Khanate per se, because instead, as we saw, he would be given the title of Great Khan and leadership over the entire empire. Finally, the youngest son, Tolui, got the lands of Mongolia and northern China, which would eventually become the Yuan Dynasty through Kublai, and eventually also got the lands of the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East. And again, to Genghis's credit, this system worked, and worked really well for a couple decades. Each brother and their families were more or less happy with their lot, and this gave them the freedom to rule and expand and fight however they saw fit without fighting against one another. Now, there were still disputes and bad blood between them, but war and civil war was avoided. For a time. But as we saw with the death of the fourth great Khan monk, the cracks in the empire, particularly the rifts between the four Khanates, really started to expand. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate went to war over various territories. The Toluid and Kaidu Kublai civil wars split the Khanates against each other twice, and because of this, all four Khanates by the year 1300 or so were their own separate empires in everything but name. They had their own politics, their own leaders, their own armies, their own cultures and ways of life, and their own rules. And then, with the death of Temur in 1307, they finally became their own empires in name. Where we once had a single Mongol empire, we now have four Mongol Khanates. And as you can imagine, each Khanate functioned and survived in drastically different ways than the others. And amidst all of this, in just a few years, a boy by the name of Timur, that's our Timur, will be born. So to understand the politics before and around his birth, we need to look at the fate of all four Khanates, or at least until Timur is properly on the historical scene. So let's begin with the Yuan Dynasty, since that's where we've been focusing on recently. The year is 1307, and Temur Khan is dead, and with him died many of the last hopes for the Yuan Dynasty. For what follows is just a hurricane of insanity, short-lived and totally inept leaders, bad luck, and a story that's sort of out of the scope of this show. So because of all these reasons, we're going to just breeze through this confusing sequence of events. And because I've had way too much coffee, I apologize for what's about to happen. Are you ready? Here we go. Temur Khan is dead. Who comes next? Well, Kublai's great-grandson, Prince Kashan, wants the throne, but so does Kublai's grandson, Prince Ananda. Prince Kashan wins and comes down from Mongolia to rule China, and this is all good, but he's addicted to drinking, and he's dead by 1311. Who's next? Well, how about his brother Biantu? He's a good candidate. Sure, that'll work. Welcome aboard, Biantu. And he's dead by 1320. Okay, next up is Biantu's son, Sudhapala, and he's killed 3 years later. But don't worry, he has a cousin. His cousin, Yesun Timur, and this goes well for 5 years, and then Yesun Timur dies in 1328. What does this mean? Well, how about a civil war? more. Well, Kushan, remember him, his son, a guy by the name of Temur, seizes power in November of 1328, but then cedes power to his older brother Kusala. Why? I don't know, don't ask questions. Kusala rules for 3 months, and then he dies, so Temur comes back into power, and then he dies 2 years later in 1332 at the age of 28. So what's next? Well, Kusala, that guy who ruled for 3 months, well, he had a son, a 6-year-old named Rinchen who becomes emperor. He only rules 2 months before he dies, leaving the throne to his older brother, Togan Temur, in 1333. And Togan Temur, the new emperor, is only 13 years old. Now, to be fair, Togan Temur actually ruled for quite a while, but as you can imagine, the situation here is terrible. The Mongol lords and aristocracy are always squabbling with one another and are still terrible at ruling for the most part, and the Chinese people are here through it all and are really getting pissed off about this whole situation. And so, rebellion just explodes all throughout the Yuan Dynasty. Now, there wasn't really any organization or clear leadership in this rebellion, or at least at first. It just sort of happened. But it was effective, and rebel groups all throughout China began to overthrow various Mongol overlords. The leaders of these rebel groups were often just dudes taking advantage of the chaos. One author I came across described these rebel leaders as half-patriot, half-bandit chiefs. And I think that description is just so great. And amidst all of this, you have all sorts of people coming out of anywhere declaring that they are the true heir to the Song Dynasty. And what's stranger still is that people listen to them. Now, this whole rebellion is super complicated, but here's the 2-minute version. Through Togan Temur's reign, he continually loses against the rebels. Eventually, he and his Mongol rulers are forced to flee back to northern China and Mongolia. It is here that they establish the cleverly named Northern Yuan Dynasty, which lasts in one form or another until the year 1635. But even when things were going well for them, the Northern Yuan Dynasty was only ever a shadow of its former Yuan Dynasty self. As for southern China, they won their independence. A brilliant and charismatic rebel leader named Chu Yuan Cheng eventually managed to unite or conquer the other rebel groups and kick out the Mongols. And this began the Ming Dynasty of China. This dynasty would exist until 1644. But all this to say, by the year 1370, most of China was out of Mongolian hands. Now, does this mean that the Yuan Dynasty was gone? That one of the 4 Khanates had ceased to exist? No. The Yuan Dynasty survived in the north and in Mongolia for a few centuries still, but it was never as powerful as it had once been, and it was on the defensive for pretty much the rest of its existence. So as far as we're concerned on this podcast, we're pretty much done with the Khanate of the Yuan Dynasty. However, the history of the Mongols in China is really complicated and very interesting, and I left out, as you can imagine, just a ton of stuff for the sake of time. But if you want to know more, and I don't blame you, then I highly recommend the History of China podcast by Chris Stewart. I'll include links to his show somewhere, but as the name implies, the show is everything Chinese history, and as luck would have it, he's actually right now going through the history of the Yuan Dynasty, Kublai, and the Mongols. So if you want to hear more, I would head there. And unfortunately, I think that's going to do it for today's episode. I was originally hoping to cover the Golden Horde as well today, but they're going to need their own episode. So the plan right now is Golden Horde next week, the Ilkhanate the week after that, and the Chagatai Khanate the following week or 2 weeks. Which means that we will arrive to Timur's early life in about a month or less, depending on how much I can get done. Thank you again for your patience and for hanging in there with me. I'm well aware that there hasn't really been any sort of predictable schedule for this thing yet, and that's totally on me. I've been looking for a new job recently. I found a part-time job, which is good, but I'm still hunting for a full-time thing. And then, of course, Christmas, New Year's, and my 1-year anniversary with my wife were all within, a week. So that was kind of nuts. I've been swamped. But looking forward, I think we'll be returning to a weekly release schedule, preferably on Thursdays. Preferably on Thursday mornings. So anyway, thanks again for your understanding and encouragement. This is the Timur Podcast. You can reach out to me for any reason at any time via email at timurpodcast@gmail.com, Facebook at timurpod, or Twitter at podcasttimur. We also have a show website at timurpodcast.com. There's not too much up there at the moment, but I've been working on a couple updates and notes that should be up there soon, so check those out if you want. Anyway, Happy New Year, and we will see you later right here on the Timur Podcast.